If you're just starting out in points and miles, or even if you've been doing it for a while now, you may sometimes feel discouraged or like you're doing it wrong. You're not alone. Listen in as our special guest discusses points, competency, and how to keep going when you're feeling discouraged or overwhelmed. Welcome to Points Talk with the Travel Mom Squad. Hey, I'm Alex.
And I'm Jess. Let's talk points. So today we have a really special guest with us. Devon Gimbel from Point Me to First Class is here. I know you all probably already know her, but if you don't, at the end, we'll go over where everyone can find you. But she is here to talk about something I find so fascinating, and that is the psychology of point competency, including why it's natural to feel discouraged when you get started with points and miles and why you're not as bad at it as you think you are. I find that I have my undergrad degree in psychology, and so I just find this so interesting. And also, this episode is coming out in January, and January is when we get a huge influx of new people who are discovering points and miles and they want to get into it. And so I feel like they're going to be in this place where they're just getting started. They're going to feel like they're doing it wrong. And so this is going to be the perfect time to cover this topic with them. But okay, so before we get into all of it, Devon, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into points and miles.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. I'm such a fan of you three. You do amazing work in this space. So this is truly just like a highlight of my career to be able to talk with you guys on your podcast today. And in terms of how I got into this, I think we all have our stories just around kind of travel, what it means to us and accessing travel. And mine, of course, goes all the way back to my childhood, like I think many of ours does. And I was always really interested in travel, but my family was not super financially resourced. I was raised by a single mom, and we didn't have a lot of funds to do a lot of travel growing up. And so I was raised in Southern California, and travel for us looked like road trips, like getting in the car, we would drive up the coast or we would camp. And that was great. But I always had this sense of this huge world, and I wanted to explore all of it. And we just didn't have the means to do that growing up. And then as I got a little bit older, I still didn't really have the means to do that, but I had this philosophy sort of like travel by any means necessary. And so again, I'm sure a lot of people have done this, you scrape together a couple bucks, you learn how to stretch them really, really far. So, I took time off in between when I finished college and when I went to medical school, and I lived in Southeast Asia for a few months and I lived in Peru for a few months. And it was basically like, how can I make $10 last me 7 days, and just doing that over and over and over again. And, kind of fast forward, when I finally finished all of my medical training, I was like 31 years old when I finished everything, got my first grown-up job. And it was this really kind of interesting experience because for anyone who's gone through medical school or knows someone who's been through that process, you basically are working for minimum wage pretty much all of your 20s and maybe half of your 30s. You're working like 80 hours a week. You're barely making any money. If you're like me, you had tons of student loans. But then you get your first grown-up job, and for the first time, you actually have some disposable income, but you feel like you're so far behind all of your peers in terms of saving and paying off your debt and all of these things. And I also, at that point in my life, realized I don't know anything about personal finance. I think one of the things about being raised in a family that didn't have a lot of, financial resources is I didn't feel like anyone taught me anything about money, about how to earn it, what to do with it, how to be responsible with it. And I was really scared because I was like, for the first time in my life, I actually have money to make decisions with, and I don't know what to do, and I don't want to mess it up. And so I started just educating myself about personal finance. And then, as happens on the internet, one thing leads to another. So I was learning about personal finance. And then there would be a little link about, how I traveled to XYZ, for $400 in business class. And I was like, wait a minute, like I've traveled all around the world at this point, but always in the most basic of basic economy. And I was like, I know how to do that. But I started reading these stories about, wait a minute, people are actually traveling to the types of places that I really want to travel to, but they're doing it in business class, which never, ever, ever seemed like it would ever be possible for me. They're staying in, really lovely hotels. They're getting into lounges. I had never stepped foot in an airport lounge in my life. And I was thinking like, what is happening here? And I was very skeptical because I was starting to read their stories about using credit cards. And I wasn't taught a lot about finances growing up, but I distinctly remember one thing my mom had told me when I was probably 15 or 16 years old is that credit cards are terrible. They're really dangerous. this is how people, get into debt and never get out. And I should never have them. And if I was going to have one, it should be for emergencies only. And I was literally terrified of credit cards for most of my young adult life. I only paid cash. Again, I was in multiple six figures of student loan debt, from medical school. And so to me, the idea of using something like a credit card seemed like this is just going to be dangerous. But I love travel so much that I was like, well, let me just check. If there's any possible way that this is not dangerous, this is not going to lead to financial ruin, let me try it. And I think that's how a lot of us start in this. You hear a story, you might be a little skeptical, but ultimately your curiosity wins out. And so you just kind of start testing it. And I started very slow. I was not that person who learned about this and signed up for 20 cards, my first year or
You
two.
weren't my mom then.
No, I was not Pam. Now, I think as many people listening to this show can probably relate to now, I wish I was Pam, but I was definitely not Pam, when I started this whole thing 10 years ago. And I started very, very slow, very cautiously, at the same time was just learning how do I responsibly manage credit cards because I'd never really had credit cards before. And that's how I dove into it, which again was a very more like easing into it than a diving. But that very first points redemption that I did on purpose. We can talk about the mistake ones, that will probably come into this conversation. But the first one I actually did on purpose and it worked and it blew my mind. I honestly thought like this cannot be real, that this is available to us. And, ever since that first redemption, now I've just been hooked, and it's been almost 10 years for me. And it's just something that I still continue every time I get on an airplane with points or I stay in a hotel with points. I'm still like, I cannot believe this is real. Like, this is really just magic. So that's kind of my background in it.
So, quick question. What was your first on purpose points redemption then?
My first on purpose one, I'm telling you, like, if you're going to go big, right? My very, very first points redemption. So this was a while ago. This was probably in 2014 or 2015. I was still working full time as a physician and I was going to a medical conference in Paris. I had never flown international business or first class before. I think maybe once I had flown premium economy, but never before that. And my first redemption was I flew Lufthansa First Class and I flew from Chicago to Frankfurt. I got the whole experience of the Lufthansa First Class terminal, which is, just unbelievable in Frankfurt, and then flew to Paris. And I think I flew the same exact thing home. And at that time, again, this was many years ago, I still think that flying Lufthansa First Class is a really wonderful kind of like aspirational points flight for a lot of people. And it was also a deal back then because you could book it through, a lot of the Star Alliance carriers. You could book farther out now than you can now. And I want to say it was something like 80,000 points through United at that point. Again, it was just like a screaming deal. And I couldn't even believe that part of it was real. So the whole thing was just so phenomenal.
Okay, so it sounds like you set the bar really high
I did.
with your first. With your first, I think my first redemption was like a Southwest flight and a Hyatt Place hotel, and so, but you really set the bar high with Lufthansa First Class. But that's amazing. And we'll get into it. I think you've gone through these stages of learning and confidence. I think all three of us have, and I'm sure everyone who's listening has gone through them or will go through them once they decide to actually start with points and miles. So give us like a broad overview of what we can expect with the 4 phases of learning and confidence. And then I think you'll go into detail about
Yeah,
each one.
absolutely. So, this is not specific to points and miles. I think this can be applied to learning any new skill whatsoever, but I don't think anyone really thinks about it in relation to points and miles, which is why I'm so happy we're having this conversation because I think when you get into this hobby, one of the things that you realize pretty quickly is that there's a lot to learn, right? Like there's a whole vocabulary that goes along with this. There are foundational pieces of knowledge. And I think it can be so easy to get really, really wrapped up in that. Like, what's the difference between the Chase Sapphire Reserve and the Chase Sapphire Preferred? And should I, get Citi points or Amex points? And all of that stuff is important. But I think if you don't kind of understand the process of learning points, what happens is it is so natural to become at some point very frustrated or very discouraged. And I think one of the saddest things for me, I'm sure it's true for you as educators and people who, have relied on points so much for so many incredible experiences, that it's so sad for me to see someone who's in that beginning phase of learning and then they give up because they do get frustrated. And it's oftentimes because they just don't understand what's happening kind of behind the scenes in their brain. And so there are kind of like four very, very typical phases that people go through in learning points. So I'll name the four and then we can dive into any of them in any order you want. But it's this very kind of predictable path where you start out and you go through this first phase of sort of like ignorance is bliss. And there's a couple different terms for it. You know, I looked at some psychology studies because, I'm weird. I look at studies even when it comes to points. And there's this really interesting kind of graph that these two researchers came up with, Dunning and Kruger, and they talk about how when you're first learning a new skill, kind of what your confidence is, how good you feel about it versus how good you are at it. And one of the first things that happens is that when you actually have very, very few skills, very low confidence in something, you feel really, really confident. And they term kind of this first phase being at the peak of Mount Ignorance. They call it the peak of Mount Stupidity. I don't like that. So I call it peak of Mount Ignorance. But then you learn just a little bit more. And the really fascinating thing is that for most people, then your confidence just takes a nosedive. And this is then kind of what's known as the second phase, which is called the Valley of Despair. And I think this is the piece that a lot of people in the points and miles kind of hobby will be able to relate to. Or if this hasn't happened to you yet, I think it's so good to know that at some point this might come because it's important to understand this is totally natural. It's like you're not doing something wrong. This is part of learning. And then if you continue to learn beyond that, you continue to gain some skills, some ability. Then what happens is that you move into the third kind of phase of learning or competence, which is called the slope of enlightenment, which I don't know, that sounds kind of bizarre to me, but I think the key about this kind of point in the learning curve is this is where you actually become kind of skilled and competent in points and miles. And it takes some effort, but you can start to see that progress. And then if you keep learning, you move into the kind of the last or the final stage of learning. And this is really fun. This is where you become what's called unconsciously competent, meaning that you're really good at points and miles, but it doesn't take so much effort, so much concentration every time you make a decision or you do something. And at that point, that's where it feels like you're just on autopilot and points and miles have become really, really easy.
That is, I don't know. I just find
It's
that
so
like,
fascinating.
and I can like think back to when I first started and like see how that's exactly the path that I took. And so I think a lot of people are going to be able to relate to that and just be like, oh, and it's and like the second phase, the valley of despair, that's where we see so many people just give up, right? Like that's where we
Yeah.
see people say, I thought I knew everything. It turns out I don't know anything. This is too hard. I can't do it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think one of the good things to understand about this hobby is that it's not like we all start at zero and then you progress kind of through these different phases of learning. And once you make it to one phase, then you're done with the prior one. I think it's good to keep in mind that points and miles involves so many different skills. And so every time, you're acquiring one new skill, you're probably going to go through this journey. A lot of us where we start is first learning about earning points, right? Before we ever think about how are we going to use these and before we ever learn about things like, partner award redemptions and stuff like that, we start thinking about how do we want to earn points? How are we going to apply for credit cards? How are we going to build up those points balances? And so I think it's so common for everybody to just understand that in the beginning, there's this, I think, initial just huge surge of excitement, right? When you fall into this world, somehow you start reading these stories and you start thinking, wow, this could be possible for me, right? And you make your first little baby step. You apply for your very first credit card, or even you look at the credit cards you already have and you realize, oh my gosh, one of these has been earning points and miles for the last couple years. I didn't even know that, right? And that first kind of like surge of excitement, I think that is really, really wonderful. And it can really motivate people to learn. But that's why I don't want people to be surprised that usually what happens next is you learn a little bit more. You actually dedicate yourself, to listening to some of these podcasts, following, Travel Mom Squad on their blog. You learn a little bit more. And it's so common to then do that shift from kind of phase one to phase two. You kind of tumble down this hill into the valley of despair and you feel like, oh my gosh, wait a minute. There's so much more to learn than I realized. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. Or what's so common is you look back at the decisions you've already made and all you see is what you did wrong. Like I talk to people all the time who say, I signed up for a rewards card. I didn't even realize there was such a thing as a welcome bonus. And I missed, right, out on tens of thousands of points. Or, now that I understand bonus categories, I finally got, my personal Amex Gold. I'm earning 4 times points on groceries and on dining. And what they actually do instead of being really excited about that is they say, oh my gosh, What about the last 10 years, where I didn't have that card? I was only earning 1 mile on my United card, or 1 mile per dollar spent on my Southwest card. Now I feel so terrible about all these missed opportunities. And so this is why I think it's so great to talk about this, to understand, again, this is such a natural process for all of us. But please don't think that if you have had that moment where, I look back on my first points redemption, not my first real one, my actual first one, I'm like, oh, wow, that was a terrible redemption, and I could feel so bad about that. And I did for a while. And then I just realized, hey, I did the best with what I had at the time. And I think that's an important thing to focus on, is not to beat yourself up about past decisions and past mistakes, is to acknowledge how much you are learning and how much farther along you are in this hobby than you were 6 months ago or 1 year ago.
Well, my husband used to redeem his points for DVDs on Amazon. So if anyone should be feeling bad about their prior points redemptions, it should be him. But even that I've forgiven him for, and I'm like, it's fine. You know better now.
Yeah, some of my
Let me
favorite
be the one
stories are
redeeming the points.
what were your initial redemptions, or what is the redemption that now you look back on, and you cringe, or you think, "Oh my gosh, knowing what I know now, I would never do that." So, I think if you haven't done it already, I would love to see a poll on your Instagram where please ask everybody, like, what is your most cringe-worthy redemption? Because I think it's
Yeah.
so funny to hear about those stories. We can all laugh and relate because we know what that feels like now.
Well, and that's why I love this conversation so much, is because this is something we all go through. Nobody just learns about points and miles and gets to, it's smooth sailing and it's easy. So for people listening, what you are feeling is something we've all felt, and it's very normal, and it's just part of the process. It's nothing to be like, oh, I can't figure this out. I'm not smart enough to do this. What you're feeling is what we've all felt and gone through. It's just part of the process of learning something new.
Yeah, 100%. I think, when I was kind of thinking about this whole process to begin with, like, what is it like to learn points? Kind of what is the natural progression that most of us go through whenever we're learning something new? I thought it was really, really helpful to learn about this description of the stages of learning, or the stages of competence, and how we go from not knowing anything about a certain hobby or certain skill to becoming good at it. And kind of the progress or the process that we go through starts with what's called being unconsciously incompetent. So this is when you're terrible at something, but you don't even realize you're terrible at it because maybe it's a thing you've never tried or you've never cared about. And because you're unconsciously incompetent, it doesn't bother you. Like, I think about all the skills I don't have and I will never have, and they don't keep me up at night, right? Like, I'm probably
Right.
never going to be a competitive long distance swimmer, and that's totally fine, right? Like, I have no desire to do that. I've never tried it before. So this happens in points and miles too, right? Before you even understand this world exists, maybe you have one credit card or you have a debit card, and that's what you're putting your expenses on. But that doesn't bother you, because when it comes to the world of points and miles and maximizing, earning your points and using them, at that very beginning stage, you're unconsciously incompetent. You don't know how to do it, but you don't realize that. And who cares? Not a big deal, right? But then you commit to this hobby, or you don't even commit, but you start getting interested. And that's when you go in kind of the second stage or phase of competence. And this is the one that feels lousy, because instead of being unconsciously incompetent at this, you become consciously incompetent, meaning you are terrible at this thing. But instead of not knowing you were terrible, now you know you're terrible. And that feels bad. Most of us don't want to be bad at something we're interested in. I think a lot of people listening to this podcast, they're probably really high achievers. They're great at learning. They're great at learning fast. And this feels bad. You can think about what this was like when you first learned to ride a bike or you first learned to drive a car. It didn't come overnight. And you first, before you got good, you were probably really aware at how bad you were, the things you were doing wrong. And that feels really, really bad. And again, we just want to reiterate, this is totally natural, and keep going, because the best is yet to come. Because if you keep learning, you keep trying, if you didn't give up trying to learn how to ride a bike or drive a car, then what happened is that you became consciously competent, meaning you went from being incompetent or not so good at something to actually becoming competent at it. You're building your skill, but you have to do it in a way where you're still really paying attention, right? Like when you were learning to drive a car, you really had to pay attention to how do you steer the wheel? How do you coordinate your feet on the pedals? How do you turn so you're not turning too quickly, or how do you stop with the brake where you don't give everyone in the car whiplash? Like you became a little bit better at driving, but you had to pay a lot of attention. Same thing happens in points and miles. And then finally, that last stage of competence, again, this is where you become unconsciously competent, where you're good at a thing and now you don't even have to think about it. You've done it so many times. It has become routine. It has become habit. I grew up, like I said, in Southern California. It's a driving culture. Learned how to drive when I was 16. Now I'm 43. I get in the car now. I don't have to think, how do I turn the wheel? What am I doing? I can put on music. I can just drive where I'm going and everything works. And it's the same exact thing with points and miles. And so for any of you who are listening to this and right now there's something about points and miles you feel bad at, right? You don't yet understand really how to get great redemptions from your points, or maybe you're really familiar with using your points on one airline and you've never tried to use them on another and you're feeling like you're never going to get it. We just really want to reassure you that you can, you will, don't give up. It's totally natural to feel discouraged. And I think the worst thing to do when you are feeling discouraged about points and miles is to say, I'm never going to understand this, or I'm never going to be as good as Pam is, accessing airport lounges. I'm never going to be as good as Alex is flying a family of 6 somewhere. That's not true. It's really not true. Just keep learning.
And we have to constantly remind people, like, we are not at the same level as someone who is just starting out. Like, we have been doing this for almost 10 years now. So I'm like, don't compare your chapter 1 to our chapter 10. Like, it's not realistic to think that you're going to open a credit card and you're suddenly going to be Pam. Like, Pam is not
100%.
like, you can't do that. But I thought it would be really interesting to kind of walk through the phases with like some clues as to like
Yes.
when you're in which stage.
Let's do it. Yeah. So, and it might be fun too for us to kind of give examples of ourselves so that again, people can see even though now we feel probably, the 3 of us, the 4 of us with Pam feel pretty good about points and miles, that it wasn't the case all the time. So let's talk about kind of that first phase of points learning. Again, so this is where what you actually know is just a little bit, but your confidence is pretty high. So this is where you are moving kind of up to the top of the peak of Mount Ignorance. And this can happen either before you know about points and miles or at all, or just kind of in the beginning of points and miles. And it's really typical to see things, characteristics of this stage of being something like, I don't know. I've actually seen this in real life. We kind of talk about it as like a funny meme, but I've seen this in real life. You probably have too, where you're at a restaurant and there's some dude and he pulls out his Amex personal platinum card, to pay for his meal,
Yeah.
for himself. And he's like, very showy about throwing his personal platinum card down on the table and like, I'm earning points for this. And you're like, well, yeah, but at a pretty terrible rate, I can think of a handful of
But
cards
he's like,
that are
I
gonna
got
be
my $695 annual fee card here.
Right,
Watch me with this
right.
flex. So you're like, not the best
Exactly,
option, dude.
right? And, like, that's what we're laughing about because that guy thinks, "Oh, I'm doing amazing, right? I'm earning points for, my restaurant bill with my Amex Platinum card," and it's true, he is. And also, not as many as he could, but that guy feels amazing, right? That is sort of the prototypical kind of phase 1 being at the peak of Mount Ignorance, where you think you're doing really, really great and you're doing good, but you just don't realize yet, like, what you don't know. And for me, I'll tell you what this looked like. I mentioned I grew very, very afraid of credit cards, and so I didn't have them for a long time. And then when I first started getting credit cards, this is when I was doing my medical training. I was living in Boston. So again, I'm like in my late 20s at this point. I was not, a teenager or anything. And I fell into that classic trap where I needed to get some clothes, for when I was working in the hospital. And I go to J. Crew, Banana Republic, and you go to check out and they say, hey, do you want to save, 10% on your first purchase by opening a store credit card? And I'm like, yes, this is an amazing deal. Again, like I had no money. I was like, let me save 10%. I am so smart, right? Like, let me get my Banana Republic credit card, my J. Crew credit card. I am on top of the world. Look at me. I'm so smart. I saved 10% off of my like $71 purchase, And then we can look at that now and laugh because I would never do that now, right? That's such a huge missed opportunity. But I think that's kind of the characteristic of this stage. It's just that you don't know what you don't know yet. And so it doesn't feel that bad. But I'm curious if you two have any stories about what you can remember, sort of like what did the picture look like for you before you knew better?
Yeah, well, before I get into mine, I think what's interesting is I can see this with a lot of other people who will say, Oh, yes, I do what you do. I put everything on my Capital One Venture
Yes.
card, and then I use the purchase eraser and I get all this money or all this like free travel. I'm like, oh, and I just tell people like, that's amazing. That is awesome. Cause that is a really awesome thing and a really great first step. But in my mind, I'm thinking, that's not what I do.
Yeah,
But that
exactly.
is really great for them. And they kind of think of it as like, I already know what you're doing. I've got this figured out. And it is really kind of fun to watch people sometimes in the peak of Mount Ignorance because they are so happy and excited about what they're doing. And it is really great. But it's kind of funny as someone who's past that to be like, no, it's not really the same thing. And it's funny because I've been there.
Of
We've
course.
experienced it. So I feel like you can kind of smile at it because you're like, oh, I remember when I used to think that too.
Yeah, and I think this is a great, really important to say. We are not at all judging this phase of
Yes.
learning whatsoever, right? Like,
We have been
I
there.
don't
Yes.
exactly. I don't think it's bad. I don't think it's wrong. I don't think people are dumb or making dumb decisions. Not at all. Not at all. This is really, again, just sort of an example of something that we all go through. And I can
Yes.
laugh about it because I could give you 100 examples of things I did, within this
Yes.
phase of learning. But I think what Alex, the point you made is so true.
Yeah. So what I think one that sticks out for myself is we had a Freedom Unlimited card was one of our first cards. The really funny thing is I think we thought we had a flex card. So we're thinking we're gonna like max out the 5X categories and earn cash back. We didn't even have the right card. So we weren't even like, we did not even know what we were doing at all. And we're thinking we have got this figured out because we're getting like $200 cash back every year for and then putting that into our savings. And so we're feeling really good about the cash back that we're earning. We also had a Southwest card and we're putting, I would use the Southwest card a lot. My husband was using the Freedom Unlimited card that we thought was a flex. And I'm feeling really, really great that I'm getting a couple free Southwest flights a year. And it was awesome. It was a really cool thing for us at the time. And now I'm like, wow, I could have been doing a lot more if I had paired that Freedom Unlimited with a Sapphire Preferred or, not used a Southwest Rapid Rewards card for my everyday spending and only earning 1 point per dollar. But at that time, but I don't look back at that and think, oh gosh, I was so dumb. I think, oh, I did a pretty good job for what I knew at the time. I was making some good decisions. And now I know more and I can make better decisions.
Yeah, I think that's such an amazing point. And also, I think this is the perfect segue to then talk about kind of what happens as you move from that first phase of being unconsciously incompetent or at the peak of Mount Ignorance into that second phase of learning where you become consciously incompetent and you fall all the way down into the valley of despair. Is that what's really characteristic at this point in learning is that you actually know more than you did before. Like when you think about all the things you've learned and the skills you've had, they have actually improved. But really paradoxically, this is where your confidence plummets. And I think it's so typical because exactly what you just described, Alex, where you have that moment where you're like, oh my gosh, if I had just known, right? If I had just known I had a Freedom Unlimited and not a Freedom Flex. If I had just known that if I also had, one of the transferable points earning chase cards, I could have basically been, using that Freedom card as a points earning card this whole time. This is so, so typical. You're in the valley of despair. One, I think that's the perfect name for it because you feel despair. You feel terrible at this. So most of us who are in the valley of despair and points, this is not a surprise, right? Like we know we feel terrible about this. But I think what's really important to kind of understand and talk about at this point is that, this is very, very, I feel like this is a rite of passage. I honestly don't think that you can become great at points if you don't first move through this phase, because
Yeah.
this is where your best learning comes in. I don't think it's helpful for us, to berate ourselves or to tell ourselves, oh my gosh, I'm so dumb, or I should have known X, Y, or Z better or different. I don't think that is helpful for any of us. But I do think this is a critical point in learning where we can say, oh, wait a minute. I actually did things not wrong, but I did things that I would do differently now, knowing better. That is sort of the critical point of how you can continue to get better. And so this is something, again, all of us move through. I remember sort of the high of booking, that Lufthansa first class
Yeah.
flight with points, right? For me, that kind of the thing that almost happened immediately after I booked that is I reflected on the very first time we actually had used points. And that was the first thing that happened to me is I thought, wow, what a wasted opportunity. The very first flight we ever booked with points was a 2 round trip economy flights, which again, that's great, but my husband and I took a trip to Morocco. We flew round trip economy. We used 250,000 Chase points, right, through the Chase portal for a $200 to $2,500 worth of flights, which again, at that point in our lives, we were like, "Oh my god, this is amazing. We saved $2,500. That's a huge amount of money." And then, though, when I booked that Lufthansa flight for something like 80,000 points, you know, it's so hard not to look back and say, "Oh my gosh, what did I do with those first 250,000 Chase points? What a waste. I could have flown, that whole entire distance or less in business class and, slept on the plane, not had really achy joints the next day." All of these things. But I think it's just so important to realize, no, 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 no. All that's happening here is we are acknowledging, oh, we know better now, which means we can do better next time.
I love that you say that it's like a rite of passage too, because it is. It's how you learn. You're not just going to know nothing and then know
Mhm.
everything. You have to kind of learn through those different types of redemption. I'm not even going to call them mistakes because I don't think they're mistakes. It's just part of the learning process. And we still make mistakes today. It's not like you learn it all and all of a sudden you just don't make mistakes anymore.
Yes, I think that is such a critically important point because, being in this space where we love what we do so much, we want to share it with other people. We want people to learn this, faster or easier than our own personal
Yeah.
journeys. I think it's still, I know you all never do this. Please, like anyone listening to this podcast, please don't think that just because you do have amazing resources at your fingertips, like this podcast, everything TMS puts out, that means that you shouldn't ever make mistakes. I guarantee you, from learning from, these folks, your journey is going to be so much faster and so much less mistake filled, than ours were. But nobody moves through this process not making any mistakes at all.
I just wanna say my ignorance to Valley of Despair was my fiancé and I at the time were putting everything on our United cards to get our flights for our honeymoon, so we each had a United card, and we thought we were doing so well, and then for our honeymoon, we booked tickets to Paris round trip in economy with, like, the most terrible layover. Like, I think we had, like, a 10-hour layover in Frankfurt, and it was an economy on United. We cashed in all of our United miles that we spent like a year and a half accumulating from putting all our expenses. And at the time, I was like, "Oh my god, we got these flights for our honeymoon to Europe. Like, this is amazing." It was only 30,000 points each way, even though we had to like sleep on the floor of the Frankfurt airport. And then like a couple of years later, I was like, "Man, we could have like flown in business or first class for our honeymoon and probably spent fewer points and like if I had just done it right." But I was like, "You know what? It was a lesson. I learned, I know better now, and it is what it is. You can't change the past."
Exactly. You cannot change the past, but we can all learn from it. And I think that that's kind of the characteristic of moving from this second phase into the third phase of learning. So, this is where I really think it gets fun. And that's why I want to tell you anytime you kind of are feeling in the dumps about what you know or how skilled you feel at points or miles, keep learning, keep trying, keep doing, because inevitably what's going to happen is you are going to gain knowledge, gain skills, you're going to move out of the valley of despair and you are going to go into the third phase of learning, which is where you become consciously competent. You actually start getting better at points and you can see that and acknowledge it. And that feels so, so much better. And so I want to give just a couple examples of what this looks like because I think probably some people are already here in some aspects of points or miles, but aren't giving themselves credit for it. So I think it's so important to acknowledge, wow, what are you doing better? What is easier for you than it was before. Even though it still takes effort and concentration at this point in the game, you actually have some great results to show for it. And so, some of the characteristics of being consciously competent at points is that you can manage multiple credit cards. I think a lot of us come into this where, like me, you've either never had a credit card before or you've had your one card and all your expenses go on that one card, right? Now, for those of us who really are engaged in this hobby, chances are you have more than one card and probably more than one card you're using on a regular basis. And just think about how great you are now at managing it. We talked about a little earlier in the episode, maybe to pull out that Amex Personal Gold card when you're at the grocery store or when you're dining. And maybe you have a different card that you use for your non-category spend, or for a different category of spend. When you start understanding how to use different credit cards, what they're good for, and you don't have to always, refer to a spreadsheet or refer to, labels on your cards. That's where oh, your skills are building, when you start to understand some things like, oh, how can you make a good deal a better deal by stacking? How can you make not just an online purchase with a card that's going to earn you points for non-category spend, but how can you also go through an online shopping portal, right? So you're double dipping, or you start learning about like even better stacking. How do you do that? And also shop with a card that's got an Amex offer on it or a Chase offer on it. And now you're starting to triple stack. When you begin to try out some of these things, that's when you are far beyond that very beginning phase of learning and just feeling bad all the time. And this happens too, especially around award redemptions, which I think can be a more challenging aspect of the points and miles hobby. Once people start feeling pretty comfortable signing up for cards and earning points, we all hit a wall when it comes to learning how to use these things and how to use them well. But again, you know that you've moved out of that valley of despair when you start being able to run some award searches on your own. Like, oh, I'm going to actually go to the United website and I know how to set up a search. I know how to do that, or I'm going to go, for people who are a little bit more ambitious, I'm going to go to seats.arrow and I'm going to look, for an Alaska award flight somewhere. When you start understanding, how to put some of these pieces together, then like you're climbing out of that valley of despair and it feels so, so much better.
I also think that speaking of Seeds.arrow, people that are entering this phase right now are very lucky because it has never been easier with all the tools to do this. Like in 2015, when I opened my first rewards card, there was no Travel Freely app. There I had like an old school Excel sheet on my laptop that like every time I opened or closed a card, I had to go enter it in. There's the Travel Freely app now. There's all these search engines. There's Seats Arrow. There's Thrifty Traveler that will just send you alerts up for like flights that are, and so I feel like it's never been easier to get to this point because of all these tools that exist now.
Yeah, and absolutely leverage those, right? These are all here to make it easier to earn points, to use points, to stay organized and on top of this. And I agree with you. I think these are enormous assets that have really, really expanded this hobby to so many people. Whereas before, it was so hard, I think, to really engage in this hobby. I sort of felt like when I was beginning, oh my gosh, if I don't have an advanced degree, in coding and computer science, there's no way, to find these award flights. And it's just become so much easier, which I think is fantastic. And also kind of, talking about these phases of learning, then kind of when you've moved beyond kind of this third phase of being consciously competent, then you get to the stage of being unconsciously competent. This is where you are really good at points and miles and you don't have to deliberately think through every single step. It becomes second nature, it becomes more routine. And I just want to reiterate, this is not like a finite thing that happens. Like you move, like there's one day you wake up and you're still having to pay attention, every time you make a decision. And then the next day you wake up and all of a sudden everything's magically easy. Doesn't happen that way, but you will notice that you start becoming unconsciously competent kind of one skill at a time. Again, maybe it becomes very easy for you to evaluate new card welcome offers, right? Like you don't have to sit there and think, is a 250,000 welcome offer on an Amex card, is that good or not? You see that offer and you think, wow, that's a strong offer. You don't have to really labor over that point. Same thing with searching for award flights. There will come a point, and again, this is not universal. It'll probably start with one program at first. There'll become a point where you just get really, really comfortable searching for Star Alliance award flights, or you become really, really comfortable. Maybe, you're someone who lives in an American Airlines hub. You have tons of American Airlines miles, so you're always running award searches on American Airlines. Becomes second nature for you to kind of know, how do I run this award search? Or you, if you become a little more involved in this, like we have, you probably start memorizing, what are the international flights that operate in and out of my home airport? Like I don't have to look up now, does Singapore Airlines fly in and out of Chicago O'Hare, which is my home airport? Unfortunately, they don't. I know that. I don't have to wonder about that. But when I'm starting to plan a trip, I will already know off the top of my head, oh, these are the major international carriers that fly directly in and out of Chicago, because I've just run so many award searches that has become second nature to me. And so that's what happens is you start just becoming automatically really, really good at different aspects of this hobby. And I want to offer to you all that's possible for everybody. And also, likely, it's not going to take you as long to get there as it took me and Alex and Jess and Pam, because again, the information is so much more readily available now. I am not surprised now when I see someone who's been this hobby for 1 year or 2 years, and they're doing things that took me 4 or 5 years to learn how to do
Totally.
because they became good at it just so much faster than I did.
No, we get people on our Facebook group who will say, like, "Thank you so much. I opened my first card a year ago, and, like, our family just went to Southeast Asia." And I'm like,
Yes.
I was still, like, 100% traveling domestically when I was a year into it. And so I just think it's great though, I'm like, it's a testament to, like, the resources and the information that people put out that they're able to absorb this and, like, make it happen so much quicker.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I love your example about that. I didn't even learn, know, really get involved in using points and miles for hotel stays until 2021. I mean, post pandemic, like I started with the award flights. I was predominantly flying solo at that time in my life. I was doing a lot of international travel. That's where I was getting so much use and value out of my points. And it wasn't until we really started trying traveling with our kids post pandemic that I realized, oh, wow, I need to learn about the hotel side of this. This is where, points are going to make a huge impact for my family now. But I just want to offer that and put that in perspective. I had redeemed hundreds of thousands of points for international premium cabin flights for years before I ever started learning about Hyatt or ever started learning about what is hotel status, how do you use points for this way. And so I think it's just a good reminder that you don't have to try to learn all of it from day one, right? You can start with what's going to make the biggest impact in your life based on your priorities, and you can move at your own speed. I see those people, yeah, all the time who go from 0 to 100 in what seems like 7 months. I'm like, oh, wow, like it took me years to ramp up. Good for them, but
Yeah.
not everybody's path is going to be the same.
And we have the opposite of that too sometimes where we have people in our Facebook group with large families and they're like, we primarily road trip, and so we only use points for hotels. We want to stay at hotels along the way. We want to go to national parks, and they don't know anything about redeeming points for flights. And so it's just fun to see, like, how different people use their points for different goals, and, like, there's not one right way to use them.
No, I think it's so important to reiterate that, right? That I think it's really common for us, especially in this day and age. I think the beauty of the internet and social media and all of these things now is how accessible all of this useful information is. And I love that. If there is a downside, especially when I think back to when I first started learning this, there was no such thing as Instagram, right? There was no such thing as TikTok. Obviously, there was the internet, but it wasn't, as much as it is today. Is that I think if there is a downside to all of this, it's that I think it's very natural, typical human behavior to look at what we're seeing online and to like reflexively compare ourselves to that. Like if I'm not doing that exact thing right now, or if I haven't learned that skill yet, it's really common for us to feel really bad about ourselves. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that because for so many of us who love to teach in this space, we never, ever, ever intend for someone to take an example that we're sharing, right? And say, oh, I'm not doing it the same way as this person. Therefore, there's something wrong with me, wrong with the way I'm doing it. And I want to acknowledge, I think that's part of the experience of being in this valley of despair is that I think one of the reasons that people get into this in points and miles into the valley of despair is because they look at the person who's been doing this a shorter period than them and quote unquote getting better redemptions, right? Or the person who travels with a large family and they're looking at the solo traveler, right? Who is able to use all
Yeah.
of their points, right? For one single person flying on an airplane versus having a family of 4 or 6 or 8, trying to get somewhere. And I think understanding that one, it's very, very typical, I think, human behavior to compare ourselves to others, but to really kind of try to stay focused on understanding when we're doing that. And when that's why we feel bad, it's a really good reminder that, like, oh, wait a minute. I don't think our measuring stick of success should be what is someone else doing with points or miles. Like, only use other people as an inspiration. I think
Yeah.
our measuring stick for success should always be ourselves. Like, where am I today versus where did I come from? Or where do I know I'm going to be in my skill in this hobby, based on my priorities or goals? Because, like you said, not everybody wants to do the same exact thing. So please don't feel bad about someone using points or miles in a way that you don't even want to use your points and miles.
Yeah.
This has been so amazing. So what are just some like key takeaways for people now that we've gone through the 4 phases, just some key takeaways that you have for people?
Absolutely. So I think key takeaway number 1 is please understand that there is a learning curve to points and miles. Key takeaway point number 2, unfortunately, I think one of the stages of that learning curve is at some point you probably are going to feel discouraged. You are going to feel bad. But the third kind of final key takeaway is please understand that when you feel bad at points, it's not because you can't do this, you will never get better, or there's something wrong or different about the way you're learning. When you understand that this is just a necessary, again, rite of passage phase that you have to go through to learn, then you can kind of reconceptualize that experience as not, I'm doing it wrong, but, oh, I'm headed in the right direction. So please keep learning, keep going, keep relying on the resources you have available to you, because I can promise you, you are all more than smart enough to figure this out. It just takes a little bit of time and dedication. So please just keep going.
Devon, thank you so much for being here. So tell all of our listeners where they can find you.
Yeah, absolutely. So my business is called Point Me to First Class. You can just find me on my website at pointmetofirstclass.com. I also have a podcast called Point Me to First Class where I talk about all sorts of different points and miles topics. And I am not nearly as active on Instagram as you all are, but you can find me on Instagram. I think I have all of 3 or 4 posts on there, but it's at Point Me to and then an underscore first class.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Devon. I love this episode. I think our listeners are going to love it. It was just so good. So you heard it from the expert. If you're feeling discouraged in your points and miles journey, remember it's a normal part of the process. It doesn't mean you're bad at points, and it certainly doesn't mean you should give up. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you leave us a review and share this episode with a friend. Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening to Points Talk with the Travel Mom Squad. Make sure to hit the subscribe or follow button from wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. Want to start jet setting even faster? Follow the links in the show notes to learn about everything we discussed in today's episode. And to stay connected and follow along, follow us on Instagram at Travel Mom Squad. We can't wait to see where in the world points and miles take you.